Welcome to Generous Theology. In this episode, Chuck and Brock examine Chapter 1, The Science of Dogmatic Theology, from Volume 1 of Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics.
We've got to put the effort into them, and so that's really what we're trying to do.
I think a lot of times as well, Chuck, when the world sort of shifts and changes all around you, expectations become mismatched very quickly. And, people just think different things are possible in a new world system. And it's like a rip in the fabric. There was a saying when we were really young, I haven't heard it recently, something like a stitch in time saves nine, I think.
Yep.
And I think there's a lot of ripping going on in the fabric of society, and where we're not able to patch that rip in a relatively short order, it threatens just ripping beyond control. I know it feels like a whole new world talking with people who have some of the newer expectations. I feel the world I live in it's not that it's no longer competitive, but it feels like a extremely disadvantaged by insisting upon maybe all of these old-fashioned mores and traditions and values and roles, especially the roles part. If there's one thing the new generation seems to not like, it's trying to interact in the sort of traditional roles. And I just naturally expect things to progress in a certain way. And when they don't, let's just say hilarity ensues, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
But I think it's a great segue to Bavinck, Chuck, if I can allow a transition here. And we've been talking about the building blocks of theology, the setup of theology, the content. Bavinck, in his first few sections here in Chapter 1, The Science of Dogmatic Theology, from his Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 1, Prolegomena work, Bavinck takes a strong interest in trying to define just what it is we want to measure and want to quantify and encapsulate when we're having discussions about what dogmatics is and what theology is and how does it relate, and dare I say it, manage expectations. We've been talking about, I think, maybe in the most generous sense, how the breaks in the 19th century that Bavinck was dealing with led to a lot of engagement around a certain view of theology that sort of came to the forefront in light of, let's call it, for lack of a better word, maybe the Kantian revolution, followed Kant, Hegel, eventually leading into the young Hegelians and into Marx and some of the more phenomenological-based schools of thought of that time. And Christianity really had to respond. And one of the chief ways in which critics like this would push against traditional ideas of Christianity was by pushing against the idea of whether or not knowledge in theology was even possible. And we've talked a little bit about that, but I think we've perhaps nibbled at the edges while maybe trying to think about how to frame this central issue. And so that's the idea of what is it that you and I can claim as Christians, as theologians? What can we claim to have when it comes to knowledge? And the force of modern and secular attacks against Christianity is, of course, around the idea of demonstration. And so the marquee position here is that if you've not demonstrated a thing to be true, then you can't claim it is knowledge. Now, we find out indirectly that's actually not a tenable criticism, but it has a lot of heft and cachet in popular opinion. And so just starting there, Chuck, what perhaps about Bavinck's investigation of this and how it relates to the task of theology, how did you read that when you were going through these sections and trying to think about this problem?
First of all, I think I don't want to jump too far ahead, but one thing I want to note about how Bavinck deals with these issues, and he talks about the content of theology and the relationship of theology and faith and questions about whether theology is a science and the science of God, those kinds of things. One thing that I'm really struck with, and this especially deals with as we get into the sections on theology as a science, he engages with a number of thinkers. One of them that he especially deals with is Captain. And I think what he does is he's very careful. He first walks through a lot of what these thinkers are having to say, and is very careful to be accurate about what they're saying and not necessarily try to get just simply start out by making certain points that he wants to make, but rather first by describing what it is that they're saying and they're thinking. And he looks at a lot of the positives of it. Maybe we'll get into that, especially with Captain in a little bit, because he does spend a good part of 8 or 9 pages talking about Julius Captain. But even before that, even in his discussions of people like Kant and Schleiermacher and later a little bit of Aquinas, he's very careful. And I appreciate that because there is a tendency, I think, sometimes for us to caricature the views of people with whom we disagree and not always be so careful about recognizing that there's often some gray. And even people with whom we disagree with their ending conclusions or with whom we disagree with where sort of the natural conclusions of some of their views may end up, there are also some areas where we can show some appreciation. So that would be the first thing that I would point out, especially in this section. But I also think that he does a really, really good job, I think, last week we talked a little bit about terminology and what does dogma and theology mean. And now he's taken those definitions and he's now going into, okay, what is the content? What is it that we're studying when we study theology? What are dogmatics and what is the relationship to theology and what kind of implications does even our view of what dogmatics are, what are dogmas, and what is the proper study of the proper object of the study of theology? How does that then impact how we come to conclusions on any number of these issues, including whether theology properly remains as a science and what can we rely on as knowledge when we're studying theology? We're creating or describing or studying dogmas, and that real care that he takes, I just found really, really helpful. And certainly, it means that he often goes rather deep, and there's a lot of words on the page to kind of dive through. But I actually don't find that he wastes any words. He's being so careful because he wants to make sure that we're getting the whole story before he then makes the conclusions that he makes. So that would be my initial reaction before we get into sort of the meat of what it is that Bavinck is saying in this area. But that's where I found a lot of appreciation. How about for you?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for preparing the discussion in that way. I think that we have to consider, you pointed out, and I agree with you, that Bavinck takes a lot of care in these sections to, as faithfully as possible, represent opposing views, other views. And you mentioned Kaftan, and of course, we've got other folks in here. In particular, I would like to draw attention to Kant and Schleiermacher and the way Bavinck wants to engage or interact with that. Now, as Bavinck talks about Kant, there's a section in the fourth paragraph that says, starting from Kant's representation that the supernatural is unattainable for us as human beings, for our capacity for knowledge is bound to its innate forms and limited to the circle of experience. Now, that's a really nice way of saying, how can we have knowledge of things that A, we have no direct experience with, and B, things that are infinite, that are beyond what we can experientially work with? And that's a really excellent starting question. Now, that doesn't mean that we can have no knowledge of things. Now, Bavinck continues by saying that regarding Kant, that there is a form of knowing, there is room for a faith that is based on moral freedom and under warrant of what Kant calls the categorical imperative. And this categorical imperative allows Kant to, he thinks, postulate things like the existence of God, the existence of the soul, and the soul's immortality. Now, Kant does not suppose he's postulating scientific theses here, but rather he's making a separation between believing and knowing. So he believes in one realm, things that about the world that are linked with the supernatural. And then he limits knowing to this idea of knowing facts which are demonstrable. And so that's really come down to through the culture today. And if you ask people, what's the difference between believing and knowing? What's the difference between dogmatic truths and truth? And I think most people will be broadly in this Kantian category in the way that we think about that. Now, the other key figure that Bavinck brings up here is Schleiermacher. Now, where Kant perhaps emphasized the rationalistic point of view, we see that Schleiermacher emphasized this pietistic view, this mystical element Bavinck mentions, and Schleiermacher, like Kant, talks about this subjective starting point in dogmatics. And this is rooted in the idea of the self, the turn to phenomenology that you and I've talked about before. Now, where Kant wants to, using the categorical imperative, come up with a rationalist way of enumerating things that are true, things that can be demonstrated in a rational fashion, Schleiermacher wants to take a different approach where truth is something that can be apprehended through this mystical experience of looking in on one's self. And so, if you've ever heard people make intuitionistic arguments, I think you can follow this plane. When I was growing up, I heard relatives and I heard family members tell me things like, trust your gut, look inside of yourself for the answer. And I don't think they were necessarily maintaining an unchristian principle in trying to tell me that. I think they were trying to say that there is something powerful looking inside of one's self for answers. Now, powerful is not always correct. That's an important point to consider here. But those are the two major trends that are introduced that I think we have to wrestle with. And I think Bavinck is wrestling with so well in these sections. And of course, there's more. He gets into where Kant and Schleiermacher will be developed further in ideas of Troeltsch and Kaftan and Ritschl. And so there's a lot more to talk about here, but I hope that sets the stage there. Chuck, do you think we're setting the stage right? Is that the grounds that we should be examining this with? Or how do you feel about how Bavinck has started that off?
Yeah, I think so. He very clearly sets out this idea of Kant's and Schleiermacher's of the difference between belief and knowing, the difference between science and dogmatics, and then kind of moves on to some arguments about that get very specifically into that get into sort of the natural development that comes from this thinking of Kant and of Schleiermacher. And it must be said as well, it's just brief, it's just at the beginning of that fourth section. He also, I think, makes an important point that Kant and Schleiermacher themselves are actually building on somewhat of a tradition, and perhaps even a tradition that in and of itself wasn't problematic, but then took some of the factors from that and took them in a discouraging direction, shall we say. And just even in talking about how in very early times, dogmatics was generally taken to talk about the doctrine of God. In theology, the content of theology is primarily about the doctrine of God, and then secondarily to other creatures and how they relate to God. And but others already wanted to broaden that out. And by the way, not necessarily in broadening that out isn't necessarily the problem. He talks about Lombard following Augustine, who talks about doctrine being of things or signs. And so he wants to talk about not just God, but also the world and man in those areas that are things. And then science, he wants to talk about sacraments. So he's broadening out this idea of what is theology. And then they grow from that. They realize that's maybe not enough. And so you have people like Alexander of Hales and Bonaventure who want to talk about Christ specifically. Hugo St. Victor talks about reparation. Some Lutheran and Reformed theologians oppose the idea that God is the real object of theology, having some concern about the knowability, the full knowability of God by imperfect human beings. He says that it's wrong to make God the object of theology. As he puts it, it is as wrong as to make a prince instead of the commonwealth the object of the study of politics, which there's some sense in that. But then Colovius, who is this reformer who kind of moves in this direction, takes that, which I think is an appropriate way of thinking. I think it's okay to think about theology as being more than just the doctrine of God, but it's also the doctrine of man. And it's things like the doctrine of the sacraments and those kinds of things. But then what Cololius does with that is not just broaden, but he begins to chop again. He begins to narrow. And he says, realistically, if we can't really know God as humans, then perhaps God is not at all the object of theology. And he begins to move in a direction where we cut God out of the study of theology, out of the content of theology, and really just focus then on man, on humanity. And that theology really becomes about living for God through Christ. It's about religion. It's about the worship of God by humans. And that's really the content of dogmatics. And that direction is really what Kant and Schleiermacher really build on. And I think that's all to say that it is always imperative, I think, when we start thinking about these issues to recognize that even moves in a direction that we might consider to be proper can have at times unintended consequences, and we have to think further ahead and ask questions about what are the implications of some of the moves that we make in thinking about dogmatics and thinking about theology, and how do we perhaps in doing some very appropriate, very necessary adjustments in how we think about things, how do we also build some fences to make sure that we're not allowing things to move into other directions that we wouldn't want it to go. And so I just found that also to be of great interest. And even though there's not a lot, Bavinck just spends one single paragraph on that issue before he really begins to dive deeply into Kant and Schleiermacher, as you properly point out, which is really the basis for where he's going now in talking about theology as a science. I think it is good to note that sort of background.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chuck. We do have to take note of that. I think one thing that is most concerning to me about Kant's turn to the phenomenal, Schleiermacher's turn inside, is this turn to self. And maybe let me just try a thought experiment with you. Chuck, suppose you and I are on holiday together and we go to Washington, D.C., and you and I have traveled and seen many of the sites. And then one day I'm not feeling great and you want to go and see one of the main sites. So I suggest to you that you go to the Lincoln Memorial and I ask you to tell me what you see when you get there. And so you go to the Lincoln Memorial, you walk up to the monument, you pass the columns, the Ionic columns, you enter the central chamber, you walk into the central chamber, and I ask you to describe and you pause for a moment, and then you describe to me, I see, and then you start to describe yourself, what you are wearing, the particular style of clothes that you have on. You're wearing a certain kind of hat. You have a certain kind of shoes and they pinch on this kind of floor. You have a certain this and you have that. You're making a sound as your feet walk across the marble flooring. And you're talking about being in this inner chamber of the Lincoln Memorial. And I ask you finally, what else do you see that's there? And you say, I see myself. What else is there to see in this chamber? Now that would seem a bit incongruent for you to walk into that chamber and describe yourself and not see President Lincoln's statue, 60 feet wide, 74 feet deep, 60 feet high. That's the kind of memorial that's designed to get people's attention. And here you've described this everything about yourself in this room and nothing about that statue. Now, what does that have to do with us here? Let me read a little bit from Augustine's Confessions. And this is from Book 1, Chapter 10 of his Confessions. Now, Augustine, the title of this chapter is called With the Eye of My Soul, I Saw the Light Within. Now, Augustine writes this: So, with you as guide, I entered into my deepest self, but only because you helped me was I able to do this. I entered then, and with the eye of my soul, I saw the light within, the light which never changes. It was not the common light of every day, which is seen by everyone. No, this light within was not the ordinary light at all. It was utterly different from any known light. It shone above my mind. It was above me because it was itself the light that made me. All who know the truth recognize it, and all who see this light see eternity. It is the light that love knows. Eternal truth, true love, beloved eternity. You are all this, my God. And to you I sigh night and day. And so, just as it would seem very incongruent for me to ask you to describe the interior of the Lincoln Memorial and have you only talk about yourself and not mention the statue of Lincoln, so too, something's changed in the modern ethos. Schleiermacher and Kant, both emphasizing faculties of rationality as well as faculties of feeling or apprehension by emotion, both of these thinkers are talking about looking within. And just perhaps you are in this Lincoln monument, they're describing themselves. And who could look inside one's self and only describe self? Where Augustine looks inside of himself and he sees this divine light. And I think that disconnect is perhaps the difference between the age of faith, the Augustine age, and what's going to come next, which is this secular form of enlightenment, this turn to self, the modern phenomenology. And I think Bavinck criticizes this. He says this regarding dogmatics. Bavinck says, science aims at truth. If dogmatics aims to be real science, it cannot be content with the description of what is, but must demonstrate what has to be considered truth. And what does that mean? Not only does dogmatics want to speak truly about reality, but dogmatics also wants to give an accounting for why what is being spoken can be considered truth. He says regarding Kant and Schleiermacher, feeling and mood are not really everything. All religion necessarily includes ideas, and that as such, these are subject to the test of truth. Now, Bavinck's proposition here, this test of truth, I think grounds Christian theology, Christian dogmatics, in something that's even more firm than the moderns look inside of self. So I could look inside of myself and perhaps see conceit, but if it does not pass the test of truth, then it can't be a theologically accurate statement. And so what we're finding here is there is this commitment to truth, this commitment to something objective, this commitment to this Augustinian light that rises above the perceptions of the individual human who is inquiring about reality. And that's something that Kant and Schleiermacher perhaps aren't doing. Now, that was a long response, Chuck, and I know I pulled you into that position there of sending you to the Lincoln Monument. I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
I really like that description, that thought experiment, because there's a sense in which we go, well, that's ridiculous. Who would go to the Lincoln Monument and only describe themselves? But I think of it this way. Now take this thought experiment just a little bit further, and I think maybe take it from Kant to Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher, obviously, there's some ways that he opposed Kant. Bavinck points out that Schleiermacher opposed Kant when he defined religion not merely as knowing it and doing, but as a certain kind of feeling. And Schleiermacher really gets into that sort of feeling of things. And Schleiermacher, to be fair, also, as Bavinck points out, tried in his dogmatic work to give an account not just of religion in general, but of the Christian religion and Christian piety in particular. And he did believe that everything in that Christian piety was related to Christ. So there, in a way, it is still a Christian way of thinking. But now let's think of a Schleiermachian, if that's such a word, a Schleiermachian thought experiment having to do with Lincoln Monument or the Lincoln Memorial. So now I go to the Lincoln Memorial and you ask me to describe what I'm seeing. And maybe I don't just say, hey, here I am in my blue sweater and my brown shoes and my black socks and whatever it is. But now I begin to really focus not so much on describing myself, but also not so much on describing the monument around me, but actually more on how does this monument make me feel? And you ask me to describe what's happening at the monument, and I say, I'm just overwhelmed. I'm just a small human in this large building. And I might even reference the fact that Lincoln himself seems so large compared with me, but it's really about me, right? I feel so small here. Or perhaps I talk about how as I turn, what really strikes me is the contrast between the way that the light shines in one direction and then how in the corner, over in the left hand corner, there's this little gift shop, and how it makes me feel like it's so strange to have on the one hand this majesty in front of me, and yet on the other hand, we still have so much of a focus on the commerce or of the tourist trap piece of it, where you're going to go and buy some kitschy stuff of Lincoln. But I'm really still focused on my own feelings about that, and how does that work? And I think that is that Schleiermachian view of how one might look at themselves in the Lincoln Memorial is not really all that different from how we often do things today, right? It actually doesn't seem, if you think about it, so strange. And I can think of many times when people who've been asked to describe a thing or place or an experience, it's really focused still on themselves. It may be themselves in a context with what's going on around it, but it really is themselves. And I really liked your thought experiment, because I think we can modify it in some different ways and show that this isn't just some ridiculousness. This isn't just, oh, who would ever describe the Lincoln Monument this way? Because actually, if we take it to the next steps, we see that kind of thing happening all the time. Now, beyond that, I think I also appreciated as you moved on and talked a little bit about Bavinck talking about how science aims at truth, and if dogmatics aims to be a real science, it can't be content with a description of what is, but must demonstrate what has to be considered truth. It's not just the that, but the why or the wherefore of that truth. And so I appreciated that. And then a little further down, I think Bavinck does a real good job of extending on that. And he says there has been a sense in which people maybe occasionally have moved away from just an extreme radical view of dogmatics as just really being a description of religion in general. And even Schleiermacher maybe moved away a little bit from that. But he says, although this reaction against an extreme radicalism is to be warmly welcomed, it is doomed to fruitlessness from the start if it does not undertake a fundamental revision of the present day concept of science. A choice has to be made. Either there's room in science for metaphysics, and then positivism is in principle false, or positivism is the true view of science, and metaphysics must be radically banished from its entire domain. And Bavinck is here saying we got a choice to make, and it's really a pretty stark choice. It's either or. There ain't no in between here. Either we've got to account for metaphysics as part of our science, and what comes from that is the idea that then dogmatics theology is a science and is something that we ought to be able to look at in a scientific way, or we're just going to radically banish any kind of metaphysics from the entire domain of science. And while I think that's the direction many in the world have gone today, I think we can also recognize that's a problem, and we even see a reaction to that. And I think we talked a little bit last week about how I've heard in the popular science news, like on public radio and things, that there is discussion of the impact that that metaphysics, that things like that can't be explained merely through empirical discovery, that there are things that have an impact. And if we're just going to cut them off and say, nope, nothing to it, can't count that as science, it's just something that's faith and it really doesn't matter for our scientific endeavor, there's in the end, there can be very much a negative reaction to that. And so for that reason, I think that what Bavinck now does in the next couple of sections here is really important. It is really making the point that there must be room in science for metaphysics.
What a beautiful analysis, Chuck. We really are in that situation. Positivism is perhaps the single most important challenge, not just specifically to religion, but to epistemology itself. And I think the conclusion that comes from this challenge, I think there was a positivist school in the early 20th century that built upon the ideas that scientifically minded, anti-dogmatically minded people were thinking about in the 19th century. But I think everyone acknowledges that positivism painted itself into a corner, that there were issues that we just could not work through by limiting ourselves to what can be positively demonstrated. And I'm thinking of the specific example, Wittgenstein, from his Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. He talks about a series of propositions that sort of present or picture the world in a certain way. And there's a positivistic approach here. Now, there's a really interesting and famous proposition number 7. And I wish I could read it in the original German. I'll read the translation. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And so this is a foundational assumption of positivistic inquiry. And in fact, it really represents the anti-dogmatic approach of the 19th and early 20th centuries. If you can't measure it, if it's not specific, if it's not materially measurable, Popper would later take this into ideas of falsifiability. But the idea being is that you cannot speak of things that you cannot specifically quantify. Now, this takes us to a bunch of though. Consider the idea of a mother's love. Could you or could I prove scientifically that our mother loved us? I think that's a tougher situation to face than many people think of. It strikes for those who had wonderful mothers, it strikes us as being one of the things that we should have to not prove. One of the things that is evidently true, that it would certainly be a dogmatic truth in a non-religious sense. If someone came to me and said, name something that you know to be true that you could not prove scientifically, I think that would be a beautiful response. My mother loved me. Now, even if I back off of that particular proposition and I take it instead to something that is much more quantifiable, and let's here think about the statement 1 + 1 = 2. Now, we know that to be true because in the 20th century, mathematicians published a proof of it. Now, here's the issue. Were people who lived their lives and spoke about reality as if 1 + 1 did equal 2, were those folks being, well, at the very least, they were being dogmatic prior to the publication of the proof, right? I mean, they were acting as if it were true, but of course they couldn't demonstrate it. And yet, when it was finally demonstrated, I think what we see here is that it was worthy of being trusted even prior to its demonstration. And that was shown in the fact that it was demonstrated. Now, those are two thought experiments that really take this approach to task in different ways. And I'm not just trying to find corner cases to obscure the issues, but rather to just point out that there's never been this neat separation at the level to which positivists who had come out of the secular forms of the Enlightenment would have us think. And I think Bavinck draws that distinction here. Now, before I go further, Chuck, let me throw this back to you with your idea of this. Is this barking up the right tree? And where would you bark next if it is?
Yeah, and I think what I would do is I would default to what Bavinck does, which is now that we've had this discussion, let's talk about theology as a science, and let's talk about what does it mean? What is the implication of thinking about theology as a science, and what and the way that Bavinck does that, specifically here in section 6 and 7 of this chapter is has to do with how he bounces off these ideas of Kaftan. And I don't know if you'd like to move to that, but that's at least, I think I can say that I appreciated the fact that that's the direction that he goes as a result of talking of these things.
Yeah, let's move in that direction here. So this is down to section 6, and I think Bavinck in the previous section has this idea and has stated this idea that dogmatics is the scientific system of the knowledge of God. Dogmatics is the knowledge that God has revealed in his word to the church concerning himself and all creatures as they stand in relation to him. And as you point out, it's in this section 6 that Bavinck draws out that there are objections here. And so we come down to the issue: is the object of dogmatics a knowledge of God, or is it the content of faith? Kaftan, as you mentioned, brings forth this idea that dogmatics is not a science, that it can't be made into a system. Now, he does grant many principles from the dogmatic side. So he does not think that religious faith is merely a feeling or a mental experience. He does think that there is a such thing as a real knowledge that definitely includes the knowledge of God. And so he does recognize the historical or the external revelation as the epistemological principle of the Christian faith. But he wants to go past that. Dogmatics, in his thinking, is not just an account of states of consciousness. That's so interesting because Kaftan does not go where modern psychology, for example, will tend to go. In modern psychology, there are these ideas of self as these states of consciousness. So Kaftan is much closer here, it seems, to Kant. He has this idea of it being a normative science. He has this idea of the authority of revelation, that it speaks in an absolute tone of voice. And when it speaks, it's not just setting forth opinions, but it's speaking about things that humans have a duty to believe and are obliged to believe. But he doesn't stop there. How would you go on with what Bavinck has to say in this section?
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that Bavinck spends a good deal of time here explaining what it is that Kaftan thinks about things and pointing out that there's at least a basis for some of this. So and it's interesting to me too how very up to date, even though Bavinck is writing this over 100 years ago, how very up to date some of this is. And Bavinck describes Kaftan as saying, "Hey, look, we need to go beyond this old definition of dogma. The old dogma has had its time. Today we need a new dogma. We have to frame the whole of Christian knowledge in accordance with the manner in which it develops out of the evangelical faith. And so that means that revelation comes before faith, but dogma does not. Dogma doesn't necessarily come before faith. And he starts and really spends a lot of time thinking about not just intellectually that revelation isn't just something that is taken up intellectually by the mind, but is taken up by the will. And as I read that description, first of all, I think Kaftan is recognizing in some ways that there may be more to the human being than merely the intellectual. But I also think that the direction that he goes in taking it much further and almost debunking the idea of any intellectual piece to this and putting it all on the will is to some extent what I see a lot of Christians doing today, and really minimizing the intellectual piece of theology and the intellectual part of what it means to be a Christian, to have belief, to have dogmatic belief, and instead to put the content of belief more on what does the will do? Where do we as individuals want to go, and how are we binding our will without really any thought of the intellectual piece of that? And the reason why I think that's so important is one of the things that concerns me that I'm seeing in evangelical Christianity today. There was, I think it was Mark Knoll, the Christian historian, who wrote a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And he points out that in recent years, we've so given up on intellectual pursuit as Christians, and so focused on just that will and that pietistic sort of focusing on how do we mold our will to God, which in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing to want to mold our will to God's will. But if we do that without any sense of needing to take the time to intellectually understand doctrine and to have good, that a lot of Christian formation is also about study of the word, study of God's revelation. It's about sitting in front of pastors who are giving good, solid, intellectually based sermons that teach us the content of theology as part of what we're doing. We go then into this direction that Kaftan goes, that then really in the end, a dogma is really just about expressing faith. It's not something to be accepted intellectually as if it is ordinary scientific truth, but faith is really just about this personal relationship with God and has his revelation as its object. The sole aim of dogmatics is to create to faith with its object. And again, there's a little bit there in what Cofton says that is coming out of a piece of truth that again that personal relationship that we have with God is certainly part of our faith, but to again make all of dogmatics, all of theology really just about our own reaction, our own will, and how that molds to God's will, and to ignore the intellectual piece of it becomes very problematic. And so what then Bavinck does is he demonstrates that if we move completely in that direction, we start moving in this section on theology and faith, and maybe I'll let you pick up some of that as well. But what Bavinck does is points out that the direction that this goes is really not all that different than what we just talked about with Schleiermacher and with Kant. And that in some sense, we may think that we're trying to avoid the excesses, avoid the problems of Kant and of Schleiermacher, but realistically, all that Cofton does is bring it right back, and that's a problem.
My friend, I think that's a really helpful exploration. Bavinck here really seems to be a generous critic of Cofton and acknowledges to a great degree the interesting and relevant points that he has to make. And Bavinck notes that when you take the distinctions that Cofton makes, this idea that dogmatics is not the science of God, there is no science of God in the sense that you would get a chemistry book that would represent the science of chemical properties. Rather, it is this religious knowledge, this religious kind of knowledge, a second kind of knowledge is gained. It's ethically conditioned. It is gained through moral experiences by actions of the will. And so Bavinck takes Cofton to his next step. If dogmatics aspires to be a science, it must give up aspiring to know God and limit itself to the development of the knowledge that comes with faith. That is to say, it must not seek to be a science of God, but of faith in God, and must always set forth the knowledge of faith as such in its relations to the inner life. Now, here's the question. Does Cofton overcome this modern turn to self? It's not clear to me that he does. Now, Bavinck concludes Cofton as saying, dogmatics will never understand the objective connectedness of God and the world. It, dogmatics, should confine itself to making clear the subjective connectedness that, to our minds, exists between the two. And so I think we have to, as Bavinck points out, find this weakness as being a peculiarly modern weakness, this idea that we are limited by our creatureliness to a knowledge of things that lie beyond the phenomenal world in what Kant called the noumenal part of reality, that we have to exclude that from our knowledge. But again, we're faced with the idea that there are many things in our lives, in our experiences, that we are quite sure we have knowledge of, that we cannot scientifically prove, that go past the subjective connectedness of our own minds. And so what is required is the ability to move past the self. And that's where the reformers are going to talk about the importance of the role of revelation. Divine revelation will allow us to do this. And we've hit the end of our discussion time, unfortunately, right here. But I think we're on the precipice of really having a great insight into what separates the medieval Augustinianism of a mature Reformed theology from the forms of theological liberalism that are going to come out of Schleiermacher and Kant and ultimately Cofton and others. Are we setting the stage to working through this, Chuck? Are we in a good stopping point for this session? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think as next week as we get into it, I think it might be useful just to finish up that section 7, because I think Bavinck does a really nice job here of taking Cofton and pointing out that he really doesn't succeed in doing what he set out to do. And then there's, of course, a really great quote at the end of this section that I want to spend a little time just talking about as well. Just so maybe that's coming attractions, but I think it does set the stage for that. And then moving forward into the science of God and what really is the place of dogmatic theology. So I think that's a good place to end. So this has been an enjoyable discussion about stuff that's really very important and much, even though Bavinck wrote this stuff over 100 years ago, it's relevant today.